Have you ever experienced this? You're walking down the street, at the market, at work, your eyes meet someone's face, and for a second, everything inside you reacts as if that person were someone you know. The heart recognizes before reason. A silent certainty arises, I know this person. But the more you try to recall, the more disturbing something becomes apparent. You've never seen her before. This feeling isn't subtle. It's strong, almost physical. The brain creates an immediate familiarity, an impression so convincing that it can even cause embarrassment. You hesitate to greet them. You think twice before looking away. And in that strange instant, an uncomfortable question arises: how can I be so sure, and have no memory? Have you ever experienced this? What's most unsettling is that this doesn't happen in dreams, nor in altered states. It happens in broad daylight, in the most ordinary daily life. And, contrary to what many imagine, this is not distraction, nor simple lapses of memory. What is happening there is much deeper. It is the brain entering a territory where perception, memory, and emotion mix, and don't always tell the truth. Perhaps you've wondered if this means something is wrong, if it's a sign of mental confusion, or if, somewhere in your mind, a forgotten memory is trying to return. But stay with me until the end of this journey, because what you're about to discover may surprise you more than you imagine. This phenomenon reveals something disconcerting about how the brain works, and about how much we trust sensations that seem absolutely real. The human brain is an extraordinary machine, but it wasn't designed to be faithful to reality. It was shaped to be fast, to recognize patterns, to decide before doubting. And, in that process, it creates invisible shortcuts that sometimes lead us to completely wrong conclusions, without us even realizing it. That's exactly where this strange confusion arises between people we've never seen and memories that never existed. When you feel you know someone, it's not because your brain has done a detailed check, analyzed internal files, and confirmed a precise memory. No. It does something far more dangerous. It compares fragments, traces expressions, emotions, a way of walking, a specific smile, a look that evokes something familiar. In fractions of a second, the brain cross-references this information and triggers a feeling of recognition. And for it, that's enough. The problem is that this feeling comes before logic, before rational confirmation, before doubt. And that's why it seems so convincing, so hard to ignore. You feel it before you think. And when you try to explain it, it's too late. The impression has already taken hold. The most curious thing is that, often, it's not the person who seems familiar. It's what they evoke in you. An old emotion. A forgotten feeling. Something faceless but impactful. And the brain, which hates gaps, fills the void with a story that makes sense, even if it's false. This is where we begin to touch on the philosophy behind what we've explored here. Dark human essence, the unsettling idea that our minds don't reveal the world as it is, but as they believe it should be. And sometimes, this belief disguises itself as absolute certainty. Perhaps, at this very moment, you are remembering someone you mistook, or a situation where you swore you knew a stranger. And the question that remains is not, why does this happen? But something even deeper: how many other times does your brain create unfounded certainties, and you simply trust them? And it is precisely from this point that the story begins to get even more interesting. And perhaps that's exactly why this feeling is so unsettling. Because, deep down, it forces us to confront something uncomfortable: how blindly we trust what we feel. How much credence we give to an instantaneous impression, without proof, without context, without real memory. And when we realize that that certainty was just a construct of the brain, something inside us wavers. If, while you're listening to this, any situation came to mind, a specific face, an awkward moment, a recognition that was never confirmed, I really want you to bring it up in the conversation. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what has touched you the most so far. It doesn't need to be a perfect explanation. Sometimes it's just a feeling that's hard to put into words. And that's okay. This space is also for that. When you share your experience, you're not just telling a personal story. You're helping others realize they're not alone in these silent mental confusions. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. People who may never have stopped to question these small, invisible flaws in the brain. And if, in some way, this sparked your curiosity, if you felt that pleasant discomfort of someone who begins to see beyond the obvious, leave a like on the video. This simple gesture signals that this type of reflection matters, that it's worthwhile to continue exploring the mysteries of the human brain with more depth, more care, and fewer ready-made answers. Now, if you feel you want to continue on this journey, better understanding how the mind creates certainties, memories, and even illusions, subscribing to the channel is almost a natural extension of this conversation. It's like saying, "This interests me, I want to delve deeper." Each subscription helps keep this space alive, consistent, and increasingly dedicated to investigating what normally goes unnoticed. And while you do that, keep that question in mind, because from here on out, what seemed like just a momentary confusion begins to reveal something much bigger about how your brain decides who to trust, what to believe, and why. This is the point where the experience ceases to be merely curious and becomes profoundly uncomfortable. Because we're not talking about forgetting a name or confusing dates. We're talking about something much more intimate, the clear sensation of recognition without any supporting memory. It's as if the brain raises its hand and says, "I know," while the memory remains in absolute silence. No story. No context. No accessible past. Just the stark, naked certainty, and that's exactly what's unsettling. The discomfort stems from this internal clash. On one hand, there's the emotional security of someone who believes they recognize someone. On the other, there's the cognitive void of someone who can't explain the source of this familiarity. It's a strange, almost subtle conflict, but powerful enough to disrupt your perception of the moment. You feel the urge to act as if that person were part of your history, but you can't find any concrete proof of it. And the brain hates this kind of gap. It doesn't handle blank spaces well. Perhaps that's why this feeling comes with a slight anxiety, a tightness in the chest, a quick thought, "Am I forgetting something important?" Because deep down, the mind interprets this lapse as a threat to its own coherence. After all, if you trust your perception so much, how can it be so wrong? This is the kind of question we rarely consciously ask ourselves, but it directly impacts how we feel at that moment. And here's something fascinating. Recognition without recollection is often more intense than a real memory. Because true memory brings details, nuances, imperfections. False familiarity, on the other hand, comes clean, direct, without internal contradictions. It emerges as a ready-made truth without apparent background. That's why it seems so convincing. There are no conflicting memories to question it. Only the feeling. This phenomenon reveals a lot about how we make quick decisions in our daily lives. How many times have you trusted an initial impression without knowing exactly why? How many choices have been guided by a feeling of "this seems right," even without clear arguments? False familiarity is just a concentrated version of this mechanism. A mental shortcut that normally goes unnoticed but in this case, is too exposed to be ignored. The most curious thing is that this type of recognition doesn't require logic. It doesn't need facts. It operates on a level prior to rational thought. It's an automatic response, built from scattered fragments. Traits similar to someone from the past, expressions that evoke known emotions, patterns that the brain has already learned to associate with safety or proximity. And when these fragments align, even by chance, the mind closes the equation too quickly. That's where the hidden truth of this phenomenon begins to emerge. It's not just about confusing people. It's about realizing how fragile our notion of reality is. How much it depends on quick interpretations, internal models, assumptions that we rarely question. The brain doesn't wait for complete confirmation to act. It prefers to act first and justify later, if it justifies itself. This directly impacts how we see the world and ourselves. Because if a simple combination of traits can generate such strong certainty, what does that say about other convictions we hold? About the judgments we make? About the people we trust or avoid? About decisions that change entire courses of our journey without us realizing the mental processes behind them? Perhaps that's why this experience is so universal. Almost everyone has experienced this kind of confusion to some degree. And almost everyone has felt that second of hesitation, that moment when the mind seems out of sync with reality. It's not a glaring mistake. It's a silent slip. A small mismatch that passes quickly, but leaves an emotional trail that's hard to ignore. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this discomfort isn't a brain defect. It's actually a clue. A sign of how the mind constructs meaning from chaos. How it transforms fragments into coherent stories, even when those stories don't correspond to the facts. It's at this point that false familiarity ceases to be merely strange and becomes revealing. When the brain creates this feeling of recognition, it is doing exactly what it was designed to do: reduce uncertainty. It prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. It prefers an approximate truth to an uncomfortable void. And this shapes not only how we recognize faces, but how we interpret situations, intentions, and even ourselves throughout life. This dynamic influences the mindset with which we face the unknown. It influences how we react to new people, new environments, and unexpected challenges. Sometimes we trust too much. Other times we distrust without reason. And most of the time, We don't realize that these reactions are being guided by automatic processes that occur outside our conscious awareness. That's why understanding this phenomenon isn't just a scientific curiosity. It's a key to better understanding how the mind operates behind the scenes. How it creates quick decisions, how it distorts perceptions, and how it builds certainties that seem solid but can dissolve at the slightest questioning. This understanding changes how we see our own reactions. It brings more awareness, more care, more curiosity about ourselves. And perhaps, by recognizing this pattern, something will begin to transform. Not in the sense of eliminating these errors, because they are part of human functioning, but in the sense of observing them more clearly, of noticing when a certainty arises too quickly, when a feeling comes on too strongly, when the brain decides before reflection has time to come into play. Because ultimately, this confusion between unfamiliar faces and non-existent memories is merely a reflection of something larger, the way the mind constructs reality as you live within it. And the more you observe this process, the more questions arise. Questions that don't demand immediate answers, but attention, presence, awareness of the silent impact of these small flaws on how you navigate the world. And while this idea settles inside you, maybe you'll realize that this journey is only just beginning. Comment below, that makes sense to me. When we start looking at this phenomenon a little more calmly, something important needs to become clear. The brain doesn't recognize people the way we imagine. It doesn't work like a camera that records a face, archives the image, and then performs an exact search in the database. This idea is comfortable, but it's far from reality. The brain doesn't see faces as photos. It sees patterns. And this difference changes everything. What you call recognizing someone is actually a silent process of comparison. The brain observes proportions, distances between the eyes, jaw shape, head tilt, microexpressions, body posture. It cross-references all of this with previous references and tries to answer a single essential question. Does this look like something I've seen before? It's not a search for identity. It's a search for similarity. And here's the scientific breakthrough that many people are unaware of. For the brain, two people don't need to be identical to trigger the same feeling of familiarity. They just need to be similar enough within certain criteria. Sometimes it's the way they smile. Sometimes it's a tired look in their eyes. Sometimes it's a neutral expression that reminds you of someone important from your past. The brain takes these fragments and assembles a quick response. And that response comes in the form of emotional certainty. This mechanism exists because the brain is wired to save energy and time. It doesn't analyze each face from scratch. It reuses internal models. It's as if it has several molds stored away, and each new face is tested against them. When it fits, even partially, the sensation of recognition arises. It's efficient but not precise. And the brain accepts this risk without hesitation. The most interesting thing is to realize that, in this process, the person's real identity is almost irrelevant. The brain isn't interested in who they actually are. It wants to know if they fit into some known pattern. If they do, it reacts as if they were familiar. And that's it. No further checking is done in that first instant. Reason comes in later, trying to catch up with a decision that has already been made. This explains why the confusion happens so quickly. Even before you form a conscious thought, the brain has already classified that person as known. And when logical memory tries to find the origin of this familiarity, it finds nothing. Then the conflict arises. Sensation says one thing. Memory says another. And you're left in the middle of it, trying to understand where perception failed. This pattern-based functioning isn't limited to faces. It influences decisions, judgments, preferences, and even instant rejections. How many times have you felt sympathy or antipathy for someone without being able to explain why? How many times have you quickly trusted or distrusted a new person? That's the same system in action. False familiarity is just a moment when the mechanism becomes too visible. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. The brain isn't committed to absolute truth. It's committed to internal coherence. It wants the world to make sense quickly. And, to achieve that, it accepts working with approximations. With simplified versions of reality. With patterns that worked in the past, even if they aren't perfect now. This process profoundly shapes our mindset. It creates mental shortcuts that we use throughout our lives. Shortcuts that facilitate social navigation, but also open the door to distortions. When everything works well, no one notices. But when these shortcuts generate unfounded certainty, the emotional impact appears. That's when the strangeness arises. The feeling of being deceived by one's own mind. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because recognizing patterns isn't just a technical skill of the brain. It's a survival strategy. Throughout evolution, quickly identifying something familiar could mean safety. The unknown always represented risk. So, when the brain finds similarity, it relaxes. It signals that there is no immediate threat, even if it's wrong. The problem is that the modern world is far more complex than the one the brain was originally designed for. Today we coexist with thousands of faces, stimuli, and visual references. The chance of overlapping patterns is enormous. Different people share similar traits all the time. And the brain continues to use the same old logic, trying to cope with a much denser reality. This revelation changes how we perceive these confusions. They cease to be isolated flaws and become symptoms of a system that operates too quickly to question everything. A system that prioritizes fluidity, not precision. And understanding this brings a different kind of clarity. Not to distrust everything, but to realize that many certainties are born before analysis. When you feel like you know someone you've never met, it's not because your memory is broken. It's because your brain has found a comfortable pattern, a temporary fit, an automatic response that makes sense within its logic. But this logic isn't perfect. It's practical, and sometimes too practical. This realization has a silent but profound impact on the journey of self-discovery. It shows that not every strong feeling deserves immediate trust, that not every impression is true, and that part of personal transformation involves learning to observe these internal movements more attentively, without judgment, but also without naivete. The more you understand how this works, the more you begin to notice these small automatic decisions happening throughout the day. Small certainties, small interpretations, little stories that the brain creates to keep everything organized. And realizing this doesn't eliminate the phenomenon, but it changes the relationship you have with it. And while this idea is settling in, a new question begins to form, almost imperceptibly. If the brain recognizes patterns before it recognizes people, what else does it recognize before you even realize it? Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. And it is precisely at this point that things start to get even more delicate. Because when we say that the brain recognizes patterns, we are saying something simple in theory, but profoundly disturbing in practice. The pattern, by definition, doesn't need to be perfect. It only needs to be close enough to convince the system that it is already known. And often, close enough is all the brain requires to make a decision. When two people share a similar face shape, for example, the brain doesn't analyze every detail meticulously. It grasps the overall structure, lines, proportions, volumes. If that fits into an already existing internal mold, the familiarity signal is activated. The same happens with the way someone smiles. A crooked smile, a restrained smile, a smile that only appears on one side of the face. Small movements that carry an emotional signature and that, if they coincide with something stored in memory, awaken an immediate feeling of recognition. Posture also plays a silent but powerful role. The way someone walks, how they occupy space, how they tilt their body when speaking. These details communicate much more than we consciously realize. The brain reads this as body language and quickly associates it with other experiences. Sometimes, it's not the face that seems familiar but the way of being in the world. And that's enough to trigger the wrong pattern. And perhaps the most treacherous factor is emotional expression. A tired look might remind you of someone who marked your life during a difficult period. A serene expression might evoke security. A closed-off demeanor might trigger distrust. These expressions carry profound meanings because emotions are one of the main shortcuts the brain uses to organize reality. When emotion takes over, logic often arrives late. Now put it all together. A facial shape similar to someone from the past. A smile reminiscent of another person. A familiar posture. An emotional expression that evokes something known. None of these elements in isolation proves identity. But together they form something the brain considers good enough. And this good enough is dangerous because it creates certainty without verification. The brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to function efficiently. It operates in an economy mode, where there isn't time or energy for in-depth analysis at all times. So it works with approximations. It accepts margins of error. And most of the time this works. But occasionally the pattern deceives. And when it deceives convincingly. This is one of the most important revelations of this phenomenon. False familiarity doesn't emerge weak or doubtful. It emerges strong, clear, confident. Precisely because the brain isn't in questioning mode. It's in recognition mode. And once that mode is activated, everything else tries to adjust to it. This has a profound impact on how we interpret our own reactions. Because we grow up believing that recognizing something is a sign of accuracy. That the feeling of familiarity is reliable. that the brain knows what it's doing. And most of the time it does. But not in the way we imagine. It knows how to create meaning, not necessarily find the truth. There is a hidden truth in this process that affects our mindset. The brain doesn't seek absolute truth. It seeks stability. It wants to reduce the uncertainty of the environment. It wants to transform the unknown into something manageable. And if to do so it needs to use imperfect patterns, it will. Without warning. Without asking permission. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because this mechanism doesn't just affect isolated moments of confusion. It shapes how you make decisions daily. How many times have you trusted someone because they seemed like a good person? How many times have you avoided someone because something didn't click, even without a clear reason? These quick judgments stem from the same place. Patterns that the brain recognizes and interprets as signals of safety or risk. The problem isn't having these shortcuts. They're part of the human experience. The problem is not realizing when they're in control. When an important decision is made based on similarity, not facts. When an initial impression carries too much weight. When a feeling of familiarity becomes the criterion for truth. And all of this happens behind the scenes of the mind without fanfare. There's no warning saying, "Attention, this is just a pattern." The feeling comes ready-made, accompanied by confidence. And it's up to you then to decide whether to question it or simply accept it. Understanding this process is an important step in any journey of personal transformation. Because it broadens awareness of how the mind operates. It shows that many certainties are constructed, not discovered. That many convictions are quick responses to complex stimuli. And that understanding this doesn't weaken your perception, it strengthens it. When you understand that the brain accepts good enough as a criterion, you begin to look at your own reactions with more curiosity. You start to notice when something seems familiar too quickly. When a certainty arises without explanation. When a decision is formed before reflection. And this observation changes everything. Not in the sense of eliminating these misconceptions, but of creating internal space. A space where you can pause, observe, and choose not to automatically follow your first impression. Where feeling ceases to be an order and becomes information. Where emotional impact alone doesn't dictate the course of the experience. And that's precisely where this conversation begins to touch on something even deeper. If the brain accepts imperfect patterns to recognize people, what happens when it uses that same logic to interpret situations, stories, and even its own identity? This question keeps echoing, paving the way for revelations that go far beyond a simple face being mistaken in a crowd. Write it in the comments, that makes sense to me. And the more we observe this mechanism in action, the more evident it becomes that there is an even deeper layer operating before any rational analysis. Because, in practice, the brain doesn't begin by recognizing facts. It begins by recognizing emotions. Logic comes later if at all. The first filter of human experience is not intellectual, it's emotional. And this completely changes how we understand this false familiarity. When you cross paths with someone you've never seen before, your brain doesn't immediately ask, "Who is this person?" The real question is something much more primal. How do I feel about this? In milliseconds, before any articulated thought, a sensation is activated. Comfort, strangeness, security, tension, curiosity. And this sensation acts like a master key that opens or closes internal pathways. Sometimes it's not the face that seems familiar. It's the emotional atmosphere it carries. A way of looking that inspires confidence. A body tone that suggests protection. An expression that evokes vulnerability. The brain registers this instantly because emotions have always had adaptive value. Quickly recognizing whether something is safe or threatening has long been the difference between survival and death. And that's precisely why emotional memory is faster than logical memory. It doesn't depend on details. It doesn't need a narrative. It operates through direct association. If that feeling has been experienced before, even in another context, the brain triggers a familiarity signal. And from there, everything else tries to adjust to that first impression. This process happens behind the scenes, beyond the reach of consciousness. You don't decide to feel familiarity. It simply happens. And when it does, it comes loaded with conviction. Because emotions don't ask permission. They impose themselves. And the brain trusts them more than it should, precisely because, throughout evolution, this has worked most of the time. The problem is that emotions don't come with explanatory labels. They don't say where they come from. They just appear. And when they appear without a corresponding event, they create a void that the mind tries to fill. That's where the confusion arises. You feel something strong, but you can't find the story that supports that feeling. And this absence of narrative is deeply unsettling. This is one of the hardest hidden truths to accept about the human mind. We feel first, we explain later. And often we explain it wrong. We create justifications for sensations we don't understand. We construct internal narratives to make sense of the emotional impact. And in this process, reality can be distorted without us realizing it. This phenomenon doesn't only happen with unfamiliar faces. It repeats itself in important decisions, in relationships, in quick judgments about complex situations. How many times have you made a decision because something inside you told you it was the right thing to do, without knowing exactly why? How many times have you trusted one path or avoided another based on a feeling that's hard to explain? This is the same mechanism at work, silent and powerful. Emotional memory doesn't organize itself along clear timelines. It doesn't respect chronology. It connects experiences through affective similarity, not logic. That's why a feeling experienced years ago can be reactivated by a completely different stimulus in the present. The brain doesn't distinguish context precisely when it comes to emotion. It distinguishes impact. And this impact shapes the mindset with which you navigate the world. It shapes your reactions. It shapes your choices. It even shapes how you interpret yourself. Because if a feeling arises with enough force, it gains the status of an internal truth, even if there is no external fact to support it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding that emotion comes before logic isn't just a scientific curiosity. It's a turning point in how you observe your own mind. It's realizing that many certainties are quick emotional responses, not thoughtful conclusions. And this realization has a transformative impact. When you start noticing this, something changes. You begin to observe your reactions more attentively. You start to realize when a feeling arises too quickly. When familiarity appears without context. When trust or distrust settles in without a clear explanation. And, instead of acting automatically, you create a small internal space. An interval between feeling and concluding. This space is powerful, because within it arises the possibility of conscious choice. The possibility of gently questioning what is happening inside. Not to deny the emotion but to understand it. To ask, is this a real memory or just an old feeling being reactivated? Is this about this person or about something that has left a mark on me? This internal investigation reveals something fundamental about the human journey. We are not guided solely by facts, but by emotional layers accumulated throughout life. Layers that profoundly influence decisions, relationships, and perceptions. And ignoring this doesn't make us more rational, it just makes us more vulnerable to our own mental shortcuts. It is precisely this type of revelation that helps us to better understand the inner workings of the mind. How it constructs meaning. How it protects. How it errs while trying to get it right. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not as a promise, but as an invitation to look inward with more curiosity and fewer preconceived notions. When you understand that, often, it's not the person who seems familiar, but the emotion they evoke, everything takes on a new layer of meaning. That confusion ceases to be merely strange and becomes informative. It shows where active emotional traces exist. Where the past still converses with the present. Where the mind tries to maintain coherence, even if it needs to improvise. And this emotional improvisation is an essential part of the human experience. It's not a flaw. It's a strategy. A way to navigate a complex world with limited resources. But the more awareness you bring to this process, the more autonomy you gain over your own reactions. Because, in the end, recognizing this process doesn't eliminate the false familiarity. But it transforms the relationship you have with it. You stop being driven solely by sensation and begin to observe it as a signal. An internal datum. An invitation to reflection. And this change in attitude paves the way for even deeper understandings of how the brain decides, interprets, and constructs reality in real time. And while this idea settles inside you, perhaps you'll realize that this journey is revealing much more than a simple misinterpretation. It's revealing how silent emotions influence everything you think you consciously choose. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. And when we connect all of this, patterns, emotions, familiarity without memory, an even more unsettling realization emerges. The brain prefers to err rather than not decide. This is not a poetic metaphor, it is a reality built over thousands of years of evolution. The human mind was not trained to seek perfection. It was trained to survive. And, to survive, deciding quickly has always been more important than deciding correctly. Throughout almost all of our species' history, hesitating too much could be costly. Ignoring a familiar face could mean rejecting someone from your own group. Mistaking a stranger for someone you know was often a lesser risk than treating an ally as a threat. So the brain developed a simple and brutally efficient strategy. When in doubt, choose the interpretation that requires less energy and offers the greatest sense of security. That's why when there's any sign of similarity, any emotional echo, any minimally recognizable pattern, the brain tends to conclude, I know this. Even if it's wrong. Even if there's no concrete proof. Even if logical memory doesn't confirm it. For the brain, this quick decision is functional. It reduces uncertainty. It maintains the fluidity of experience. This behavior reveals a hidden truth about how we deal with the world. We are not machines of constant rational analysis. We are adaptive systems that make decisions based on subjective probabilities. The brain doesn't wait for all the information to be available. It works with what it has. And what it has is almost always incomplete fragments. This logic isn't limited to recognizing people. It extends throughout our mental life. When you draw quick conclusions about a situation. When you form an instant opinion. When you feel confidence or distrust without being able to explain it. All of this follows the same principle. Deciding now is better than standing still trying to understand everything. And this makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. A brain that freezes in the face of uncertainty does not survive. A brain that decides, even with a margin of error, moves forward. Perfection was never the goal. Continuity was. And this preference for action has profoundly shaped our modern mentality, even in a world where the risks are no longer the same. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because understanding that the brain prefers to err rather than not decide changes how you interpret your own certainties. That strong feeling of familiarity ceases to be an isolated mystery and becomes part of a larger pattern. A pattern of functioning that prioritizes quick responses, not meticulous verification. When the brain encounters someone who triggers a known pattern, it doesn't ask if it's 100% true. It asks if it's plausible enough to act on. And if it is, it moves forward. Detailed verification can happen later, if there's time, energy, and motivation. But the initial decision has already been made. This explains why false familiarity is so convincing. It stems from a system that wasn't designed to doubt itself in real time. The brain trusts its own heuristics. It trusts the shortcuts it has built up over a lifetime. And questioning those shortcuts requires a conscious effort that we don't always make. This preference for making quick decisions has a profound impact on our personal journey. Because over time we accumulate decisions based on initial feelings. We build narratives about who we are, about who others are, about what is safe and what is dangerous. Many of these narratives make sense. Others not so much. But they all stem from the same impulse, to reduce uncertainty. And reducing uncertainty is one of the greatest needs of the human brain. The unknown generates discomfort. It generates tension. It generates anxiety. So the brain does what it can to transform the unknown into something known, even if that familiarity is illusory. Even if it's only a rough approximation of reality. When you feel you know someone you've never met, your brain is doing exactly that. Is trying to fit the new into something old. Is trying to protect you from the emptiness of not knowing. Because for it, not knowing is more threatening than being wrong. This revelation has a transformative impact when you begin to apply it to other areas of life. How many decisions do you make every day based on fleeting feelings? How many times do you act because it feels right, without investigating further? How many times do you avoid questioning a certainty because questioning requires stopping, reflecting, and sustaining the doubt? Recognizing this pattern doesn't mean abandoning intuition. It means understanding its limitations. It means understanding that intuition is a powerful but imperfect tool. That it was shaped for contexts very different from the current ones. And that, in a complex world, deciding quickly isn't always the best path, even if it's the most comfortable. When you recognize that the brain prefers to err rather than not decide, something changes in how you relate to your own perceptions. You begin to observe more carefully those certainties that arise effortlessly. You begin to gently distrust what seems too obvious. You begin to create space for doubt as a healthy part of the process. This change doesn't happen all at once. It's a journey. A mindset adjustment. A silent training of attention to the inner workings of the mind. You begin to realize when a decision stems from fear of the unknown, and not from real analysis. When familiarity arises merely to alleviate the tension of not knowing. And little by little, this awareness brings more freedom. Not the freedom to never be wrong, that's impossible, but the freedom to be wrong with more clarity. To know that that certainty might just be a quick answer, not a definitive truth. To accept that the brain does the best it can with the tools it has. This perspective broadens our understanding of the phenomenon we are exploring. Confusing people we've never met ceases to be merely a strange curiosity and becomes a direct reflection of the mental architecture that sustains us. A reminder that the human mind is efficient, adaptive, creative, and profoundly fallible. And the more you observe this process, the more you realize that this preference for quick decisions isn't limited to facial recognition. It permeates relationships, choices, beliefs, and the stories we tell ourselves. Stories that help us move forward, but that don't always correspond to the complete reality. And it is precisely at this point that new questions begin to arise. If the brain prefers to err rather than not decide, what happens when it needs to deal with even more ambiguous situations? With scenarios where there are no clear patterns, nor familiar emotions to rely on? This question begins to open up space for even deeper understandings of how we deal with the unknown. Comment below, that makes sense to me. And that's precisely why for many people this phenomenon seems random. It happens on some days in some places with some people, and never when we expect it. But the truth is it doesn't appear out of nowhere. It becomes stronger when the brain is operating at its limit. When internal resources are overloaded. When the mind is already dealing with more stimuli than it can calmly process. Fatigue is one of the first amplifiers of this error. When the body is exhausted, the brain automatically enters economy mode. It reduces checks, shortens processes, cuts steps. Instead of analyzing deeply, it begins to rely even more on mental shortcuts. And patterns gain absolute priority. In a state of fatigue, any similarity becomes sufficient argument. Any emotional echo becomes proof. Familiarity appears more easily because the brain doesn't have the energy to question. Stress acts similarly but with an extra ingredient, urgency. Under stress, the brain interprets the environment as potentially threatening. It speeds up decision-making. Anticipating responses becomes a form of protection. And in this state, quickly recognizing someone as familiar can generate a false sense of control. It's as if the mind were saying, I already understand this. Even if it doesn't. Crowded environments also contribute significantly to this. Places with many people, noise, movement, and visual information demand an enormous processing effort. The brain needs to quickly filter what matters and what can be ignored. And in this accelerated filtering process, it begins to operate almost exclusively on general patterns. There is no time to analyze faces accurately. Recognition becomes crude, approximate. And in this scenario, confusing people becomes much more likely. Anxiety adds another, even more intense layer. When we are anxious, the mind is turned inward, not outward. Part of our attention is trapped in thoughts, worries, and anticipations. The brain becomes divided. And when this happens, external perception loses sharpness. Recognition relies even more on vague sensations, fleeting impressions, and automatic emotional responses. False familiarity thrives in this environment. Excessive stimuli are perhaps the most invisible factor of all. We live surrounded by screens, images, faces, videos, and constant visual references. The human brain has never been prepared to handle this volume of information. So it does what it has always done. It simplifies. It groups. It generalizes. It creates broad categories. And the more stimuli that enter, the less refined the recognition becomes. The mind begins to process the world in blocks, not in details. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when all these factors combine, fatigue, stress, crowded environments, anxiety, and excessive stimuli, the brain enters a very specific state. A state where it operates almost on autopilot. Decisions are made based on the bare minimum. And the feeling of familiarity begins to emerge much more frequently. This is where many people say, it just happens out of nowhere. But it doesn't. It happens when the mind is already overloaded. When the capacity for fine analysis is temporarily reduced. When the brain is prioritizing continuity, not precision. And understanding this completely changes how you interpret experience. Because it ceases to be an isolated mystery and becomes a direct reflection of the internal state. A silent thermometer of how your mind is dealing with the environment. The more pressured it is, the more it relies on shortcuts. The more tired it is, the less it verifies. The more stimulated it is, the more it generalizes. This explains why the same face can seem familiar one day and completely strange the next. It's not the person who has changed. It's the state of their brain. Perception is not static. It fluctuates according to internal and external context. And this reveals something important about our mental journey. We don't perceive the world neutrally. We perceive the world through the filter of our internal state. This perception has a profound impact on how we deal with ourselves. Because often we judge these confusions as personal failings. as signs of distraction, weakness, or inattention, when, in fact, they are natural responses from an overloaded system trying to cope with excess. When you understand this, something begins to transform. You start to observe these moments of confusion with more compassion. Instead of criticizing yourself, you begin to ask yourself, what was my energy level like? What was my focus like? What was happening behind the scenes in my mind at that moment? This mindset shift is powerful because it gives you back a sense of agency. You realize you don't control everything, but you can observe patterns. You can notice when you're most vulnerable to these mental shortcuts. You can recognize the signs of overload before they manifest as perceptual confusion. And this goes far beyond confusing people on the street. These same factors influence important decisions, difficult conversations, impulsive choices, misinterpretations. Whenever the brain is exhausted or overloaded, it tends to oversimplify reality. And oversimplifying almost always means losing important nuances. This is one of the great behind-the-scenes aspects of the modern mind. We live at a pace that constantly pushes the brain to its limits. And at this pace it responds in the way it knows how, using increasingly faster shortcuts. The phenomenon of false familiarity is merely a visible manifestation of this invisible process. When you begin to see this, that strange feeling ceases to be just an annoyance and becomes a sign. A silent warning that something is demanding too much of your mind. An invitation to pause, to observe, to reflect on how you are navigating your own inner journey. And as this understanding deepens, a natural curiosity arises about how far these shortcuts can go. If they appear more strongly when the mind is overloaded, what else does the brain distort at these times? What other perceptions are affected when we are tired, anxious, or immersed in too many stimuli? This question begins to open up a new area of investigation. A space where we are no longer just talking about confused faces, but about how mental state influences everything you believe you are perceiving clearly. Comment below, that makes sense to me. After all this, it's almost inevitable that a question will start forming inside. Is this normal, or is it a sign that something is wrong? This doubt arises because when the mind plays such a convincing trick on us, the first impulse is to distrust ourselves, to question our own memory, to question our own lucidity. And it is precisely here that it is worth slowing down a little and looking at this phenomenon more clearly, without alarmism but also without ignorance. In the vast majority of cases, this is absolutely normal. It's part of the expected functioning of a healthy, adaptive brain, operating in a world too complex to be analyzed in detail all the time. Confusing people we've never seen, feeling familiarity without remembering, having the sensation of "I know this" without being able to explain where from. All this happens because the brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Interpret quickly, reduce uncertainty, and maintain the continuity of experience. This type of occasional confusion does not indicate memory loss, nor serious cognitive impairment, nor any hidden mental breakdown. On the contrary, it indicates that the brain is active, integrating information, cross-referencing patterns, and reacting to emotional and contextual stimuli. It is a byproduct of a highly efficient, albeit imperfect, system. And this imperfection is part of the human condition. The problem only begins when this type of experience ceases to be isolated and becomes constant, intense, and disorganizing. When the confusion is not limited to an isolated moment but repeats itself with excessive frequency. When the person begins to confuse familiar faces with unfamiliar ones repeatedly. When the feeling of familiarity is accompanied by profound anguish, intense fear, or a clear loss of orientation. Then yes, it warrants attention. Not because it automatically means something serious, but because any significant and persistent change in mental functioning deserves careful observation. The brain, like the body, gives signals when something is out of balance. And ignoring these signals is not strength, it's negligence. The difference lies in understanding the context, frequency, and impact of these experiences on daily life. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a very important line that separates normal phenomena of the human mind from situations that require investigation. And that line isn't in the experience itself, but in how much it interferes with your daily life. An occasional misinterpretation is expected. A succession of confusions that generates constant suffering is not. Here's a hidden truth that few people consider. The brain doesn't function in isolated compartments. It reflects the overall state of a person's life. Sleep, diet, chronic stress, emotional overload, prolonged anxiety, all of these directly impact how the mind perceives and organizes reality. Often, what seems like a cognitive problem is actually a sign of accumulated emotional strain. That's why reassuring doesn't mean minimizing. It means contextualizing. Understanding that most people will experience this kind of confusion at some point in their lives, especially during periods of increased pressure, transformation, or internal change. Moments when the mindset is being challenged beyond the usual. Moments when important decisions are being made. Moments when the brain is dealing with multiple demands at the same time. During these phases, mental shortcuts become more evident. Failures become more noticeable. Not because the mind is worse, but because it is operating at its limit. And recognizing this is a gesture of emotional intelligence. It's realizing that not all strangeness is pathological. Not every mistake is a sign of something broken. Sometimes, it's just a reflection of a system trying to handle too many things at once. At the same time, there is an enormous gain in maturity when we learn to observe these phenomena without fear, but with responsibility. When we understand that the brain is not a perfect instrument, but it is also not an enemy. It is an ally that works with probabilities, not absolute certainties. And sometimes, it makes mistakes trying to protect us. This understanding brings confidence. Not the naive confidence of thinking everything is always all right, but a conscious confidence that knows how to differentiate noise from signal. That understands when something is part of the human experience and when it deserves extra attention. This is a skill that develops through observation, not paranoia. And the more you understand this, the more you realize that these confusions don't arise in isolation. They are part of a larger set of internal adjustments. Adjustments of perception. Adjustments of interpretation. Adjustments in the way the mind organizes the world around it. Often these adjustments happen precisely during periods of growth, change, or profound questioning. This completely changes the narrative. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" the question becomes, "What is this showing me about how my mind is working right now?" This shift in perspective is transformative, because it moves the focus from fear to curiosity, from judgment to investigation, from anxiety to awareness. And this awareness is what allows one to navigate these experiences with greater balance. Not by trying to eliminate mistakes, but by understanding what they reveal. Not by seeking absolute control, but by developing a more honest relationship with one's own mental limitations. This strengthens the mindset. It broadens clarity. It reduces the emotional impact of these confusions when they arise. Ultimately, recognizing that this is normal in most cases doesn't diminish the phenomenon. On the contrary, it gives it its proper place within human experience. A place that is not one of threat, but of information. A place that points to the inner workings of the mind and how it deals with excess, pressure, and uncertainty. And when necessary, it also points to the importance of seeking support, adjusting routines, and taking care of one's emotional and mental well-being. Not as a sign of weakness, but as a natural part of the journey for those who want to live with more clarity and less internal noise. As this understanding takes hold, something interesting begins to happen. That strange sensation loses some of its frightening power and gains a new meaning. It ceases to be merely a mistake and becomes an invitation to observation. A reminder that the mind is always negotiating between speed and precision, between comfort and truth. And it is precisely from this understanding that new layers of this phenomenon begin to reveal themselves. Layers that speak not only to confusing faces, but to how the brain constructs the sensation of reality all the time, even when you believe you are fully aware of what you see. Write it in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." After going through all of this, it becomes difficult to continue viewing this phenomenon as something small or isolated. Because at its core it reveals a truth that often goes unnoticed in everyday life. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as our brain interprets it. And this interpretation happens all the time, silently, without asking permission, without warning when it's oversimplifying. When you mistake someone you've never seen, it's not just a curious error. It's a glimpse into how the mind constructs reality in real time. A moment when the behind-the-scenes aspects become visible. When invisible filters, shortcuts, and assumptions appear for a second, before hiding again behind a sense of normalcy. Human perception is not a transparent window to the world. It is a translation system. The brain receives raw stimuli, light, shapes, sounds, expressions, and transforms all of this into something comprehensible. But to do this quickly enough, it needs to simplify. It needs to cut corners. It needs to assume things. And each of these choices leaves marks on how you perceive reality. This specific error shows how much we rely on automatic interpretations. It shows that a feeling of certainty is no guarantee of truth. It shows that what seems obvious may simply be the result of an imperfect fit between old patterns and new stimuli. And yet, we experience it as if it were objective reality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. because this observation doesn't just apply to unfamiliar faces. It applies to almost everything. To opinions we form quickly. To judgments about people. To decisions that seem intuitive. To certainties that arise effortlessly. The brain is always filling in gaps, even when we don't realize they exist. There is a hidden truth here that completely transforms how we understand the mind. The brain doesn't wait to have all the data to construct a narrative. It creates a functional version of reality based on what is available at that moment. And then, it defends that version with conviction. Not because it is absolutely true, but because it is sufficient to move forward. This logic profoundly shapes the human mindset. We create internal narratives all the time. Stories about who we are. About who others are. About what is safe, dangerous, familiar, or strange. Many of these narratives work well. Others deceive us. But all are constructs. None is a faithful copy of the external world. When you understand this, something begins to change in the way you relate to your own perceptions. You become less self-skeptical and more observant. Instead of thinking, my mind failed me, you begin to realize, my mind interpreted. This change seems subtle, but it has a profound impact on how you navigate life. Because interpreting is not the same as being wrong. Interpretation is inevitable. It's the only way we have to deal with the complexity of the world. The problem arises when we confuse interpretation with absolute truth. When we believe that what we feel or perceive is exactly what is happening, without filters, without distortions, without shortcuts. This specific phenomenon reminds us that perceived reality is always mediated. Always traversed by past experiences, stored emotions, learned patterns, internal states. The brain doesn't switch these filters on and off. They're always active. Even when you think you are being totally rational, totally lucid, totally objective. This realization might be uncomfortable at first. Because it challenges the idea of control. The idea that we are in command of our decisions and perceptions all the time. But, at the same time, it can be liberating. Because it opens up space for more cognitive humility. For more curiosity. For less rigidity. When you accept that the mind works with shortcuts, you begin to create space to gently question your own certainties. To listen more. To observe before reacting. To recognize that a strong feeling doesn't need to be obeyed immediately. That familiarity doesn't need to be treated as proof. That an initial impression can be just that, initial. This awareness doesn't eliminate filters, but it changes your relationship with them. You begin to see them as tools, not as final truths. As maps, not as the territory. And this transforms how you deal with conflicts, choices, and even your own identity. Because ultimately, this era reveals something even greater. The human mind is always trying to create coherence. Even when the world is ambiguous. Even when information is incomplete. Even when reality doesn't offer clear answers. The brain prefers an imperfect story to chaos. It prefers an assumption to avoid. It prefers interpretation to admitting it doesn't know. And that explains a lot. It explains why we cling to narratives. Why we resist changing our minds. Why we defend certainties even in the face of doubt. Why often we see what we expect to see, not what is really there. All of this stems from the same impulse. To maintain a sense of continuity and meaning. This understanding changes the way you observe not only the external world but the internal one as well. You begin to notice thoughts as interpretations, not as facts. Emotions as signals, not as commands. Sensations as partial information, not as absolute truths. And this brings a different kind of clarity. A clarity that is not rigid but flexible. That accepts complexity. That understands that living is navigating between versions of reality, not reaching a definitive version. That recognizes that making mistakes is part of the process, because interpretation is inevitable. And perhaps that's exactly what this phenomenon is showing, in such a direct and disconcerting way. That the mind is neither a camera nor a mirror. It is a narrator, a translator, a builder of meaning. And sometimes, this construction becomes too visible to be ignored. As this idea settles in, you may begin to notice small changes in how you observe the world. Small pauses before concluding. Small doubts before reacting. Small internal questions arising where before there was only certainty. And these small changes are the beginning of something bigger. Because when you understand that reality passes through invisible filters, you begin to open yourself to a different journey. A journey of greater awareness, less automatism. Of more observation, less impulse. Of more curiosity about your own mental inner workings. And it is at this point that this reflection connects with something even deeper about who you are and how you construct meaning in each moment. Write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation truly resonated with you. Perhaps it wasn't a definitive answer, but a feeling, a subtle unease, a question that lingered as the video progressed. And that, in itself, speaks volumes. This type of content only makes sense when it finds someone willing to look inward with a little more calm. If this reflection stayed with you until the end, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." It's a simple way to show your presence and that you were here, fully present, going through this journey with me. Reading this creates a real connection between people who are silently asking themselves the same questions. If at any point you felt that this video put into words something you've already experienced, leave a like. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign of appreciation for this exchange. This feedback helps this type of content continue to exist and reach those who are also ready for this kind of reflection. And if you find that you enjoy this deeper dive, where science, mind, and perception meet without easy answers, subscribing to the channel is a natural step. Not to consume more videos but to continue this conversation over time, with topics that provoke, unsettle, and broaden your perspective on what happens behind the scenes of the human mind. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. It expands on this reflection from another angle and further explores this strange feeling of certainty that isn't always true. Click there and continue watching. Perhaps the most unsettling thing of all is realizing that the initial strangeness, that face that seemed familiar, was never about the other person. It was always about how your mind constructs the world while you believe you are merely observing. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality,